Wendy Weiser is the vice president of that democracy program. She joins us for this discussion, and also joining us is Michael McDonald. He's the professor of political science at the University of Florida, author of From Pandemic to Insurrection, Voting in the 2020 U.S. presidential election. He's probably our nation's foremost expert on counting the vote. So we have somebody understanding on getting who gets to vote and who counts the vote. So, Wendy, let's start with who gets to vote. This Brennan Center report hit during the last midterm election. So, in how many states and in what ways do you claim that voting rights and the access to being able to register to vote has gotten worse and more restrictive?
Well, sadly, we actually have a record number of new laws across the country that make it harder for eligible Americans to vote. Heading into this midterm election, voters in 20 states are going to face 33 new laws making it harder to vote that were not in effect in the last election. That is on top of an additional 20 states that made it harder to vote between 2018 and 2020. So we are seeing a dramatic effort to decrease access to voting in America in at least half the states. And this is actually historically high levels. We haven't seen anything like this since after the Civil War.
Now, Wendy, the counter is going to be this. We're taping on October 20th. Okay, we're about less than 3 weeks from Election Day. We've had record early vote turnout in Georgia, a state that some on the left has said became more restrictive. More people are voting than ever before. So that's the retort that many on the right would say to this. How do you respond to that?
Well, it's great news when more people are voting, and we did see record voter turnout in the 2020 election and in the Georgia primaries, but not all voters have benefited from that increased access equally. And we have actually documented a significant growth in the racial turnout gap in Georgia in particular and across the country in 2020 and in these midterm elections. So right now, the racial turnout gap between Black voters and white voters in Georgia is at the highest point it has been in over a decade since Georgia started putting in place these new laws.
And that used to be reversed, right? Weren't Black voters actually turning out at a higher rate than white voters in Georgia for a long time?
There was a brief period of time, and Professor McDonald is, in fact, the nation's leading expert on those turnout rates, where Black voter turnout rates did exceed in some parts of the country the turnout rates of white voters in the elections where President Obama was running for office. That was a brief window, and we have seen a dramatic downward trajectory since then, or growth in that gap since then.
Michael, let me go to you. We've seen a lot of changes in how the vote's going to get counted, who gets to supervise the vote. Based on your reading of all these new laws, where do you expect there to be more complications to the vote count than there were, say, in 2020 or 2018?
Well, unfortunately, we really haven't resolved problems with the voting counting in places where we had problems in 2020. So we can just look back at those same states, particularly with the mail ballots, in places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, where election officials were delayed in even beginning the counting of the mail ballots within those states until Election Day, and that delayed the count, and then it leads to these false perceptions that there were these big mail dumps of ballots coming out on election night. Those were just the ballots being counted, and unfortunately election officials in those states couldn't do it. You know, in contrast, you look at Florida, our election officials can count those ballots beforehand. They process those ballots, and they're the very first numbers that we get out of Florida on election night. So there's no reason why Florida can do something. Hey, look, you know, since 2000, Florida's actually done better in some ways in its election administration. Right. Why can't the rest of the country follow our lead?
What would you say, Michael, when it comes to this issue of counting the vote? Where are we vulnerable? Where should there be true concern about fraud?
Well, look, there have been studies done even by the Heritage Foundation, which is one of the groups that has been leading this drumbeat of voter fraud. And it's a very, very small problem. Where it does happen, where we do see vote fraud, it's in local elections, like primary elections, where the turnout is really, really low. And so there's actually a way to manipulate an election outcome. But there's no evidence, zero, no evidence, none in court, none from any Republican elected officials that says that there were any fraudulent votes that would have changed the outcome of the 2020 election. It's just so hard to do for a statewide election.
The decimal point of this, I mean, are we talking 0.00%, 1% chance of fraud? I mean, how many zeros are there before you get to a numeral?
I mean, it depends on how you want to count it, but there are lots of zeros in front of that decimal. And so it's, yes, you can't rule out, there are people who commit fraud, all right? Any activity that we do as human beings, there are some people who do that. But a sort of massed, organized fraud, that doesn't happen.
All right, I want to talk about two potential fixes on both sides of this equation, counting the vote and registering the vote. So, Wendy, let me start with you. You know, when you think about it, how we go through airline screening, okay? If every registered voter had a barcode in some form, rather than barcode, they used it either voting in person or via the mail, doesn't that eliminate voter fraud right there, double voting, which is the real fear? And are these solutions, they sound simple, or are they just too complicated to implement?
Well, there are versions of that kind of solution that are being put in place across the country. The automatic voter registration systems that we are seeing in more than half the country now actually take pre-vetted government data and use it to register people who want to be registered to vote. We also see barcoding being used in mail voting as a way of maintaining the security and integrity of those ballots as well. And
you could pass a federal law that said you have to have some form of this without having to encroach on the states and how they would implement it, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I do think what we are seeing with the attack on voting rights at the state level and the growth of other efforts, like whether it's politically motivated police efforts, as we've just seen, or whether we're seeing now insider threats and attempts to tamper with election equipment or manipulate results, we do need more federal legal safeguards to both deter this kind of misconduct, but also to address it. And they can do that very consistent with leaving states their traditional role in actually administering elections.
And Michael, you have suggested to me in a previous podcast that we did, you know, have an agreed upon time that you present results and you don't report official results until X date. Maybe it's 24 hours after Election Day, 48 hours after Election Day. You know, there's the transparency advocate in me says, ooh, I don't know. But you feel like this could eliminate some of the sort of the roller coaster people had between red and blue waves, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, you would think transparency is a good thing, that people being exposed to the process would make them more informed. But we've seen, though, particularly in the 2020 election, that innocent actions that people were taking are taken out of context. And suddenly someone throwing away a sample ballot that was included with a ballot return envelope becomes someone destroying a ballot, and that person has to go into hiding because there are death threats against them. So sometimes transparency isn't all it's cracked up to be. And if we had a period of time where election officials, instead of trying to rush to get those election results out as soon as they can, take a couple minutes, do some error checking, look for outliers. You know, you can detect these things pretty easily, and then recheck where you're seeing outliers and say, okay, that Antrim County, Michigan, where there was a tabulation error that was programmed in the tabulating equipment, that could have been detected. We all saw it on election night. We knew it was an error, and we discounted it. And fortunately, we had a paper trail there, and we could see in the actual paper ballots that, yeah, that was an error, and Antrim knew what went wrong there, and so it got fixed pretty quickly. But there was a period of time of a few hours where there's an error out there, and that launched a million conspiracy theories about Dominion voting systems that are just false.
Michael McDonald, Wendy Weiser, like I said, two terrific experts on this issue of figuring out who gets to vote and figuring out how we count the vote. Thank you both.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.